Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Putting the Puzzle Together, COVID-19 Relief for Performing Artists, Arts Workers, and Arts Organizations. My name is Robbie Otley, and I am the Senior Associate for Programs and Resources at the Association of Performing Arts Professionals. As we get started, let's review a few technical items. Closed captioning for this webinar is available by clicking on the closed captioning button at the bottom of the Zoom window as indicated in this slide. We collected questions for today's webinar in advance through the registration process, and our panelists will be responding primarily to those questions. If you have additional questions during the webinar, we ask that you utilize the Q&A or the chat function. We'll address as many questions as possible during the webinar, and you may post your question at any time. We'll also be recording this webinar on our website within the next few days. So now let's kick things off. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Alliance of Performing Arts Conferences. This group consists of representatives from the nation's regional performing arts conferences. The organization meets annually to discuss trends in the field and identify common areas of improvement. Since early March, APAC has been working closely together to provide up-to-date content related to the COVID-19 crisis and ideas for solutions to our various constituencies. APAC members include Arts Midwest, Arts Northwest, the Association of Performing Arts Professionals, International Performing Arts for Youth, Western Arts Alliance, Folk Alliance, South Arts, North Carolina Arts Market, ArtsReady, and NAPAMA. So I'd like to introduce our host for today's webinar, Krista Bradley, the Director of Programs and Resources for the Association of Performing Arts Professionals, and Tim Wilson, Executive Director of Western Arts Alliance. Y'all can take it away.
Thanks, Robbie. So today our panel will be discussing the relief provisions of the CARES Act, including small business loans, paid leave, pandemic unemployment assistance, and provisions for artists. We are so pleased to have this great panel with us today. You'll be hearing from Heather Noonan, Vice President of Advocacy from the League of American Orchestras, Lakeisha Caton, Counsel, Employment and Labor Law Division at Pryor Cashman, and Maura Brennan, Executive Director of the MAP Fund, which is a partner for the Artist Relief Fund. A note before we all get started, except for Lakeisha, none of us else are lawyers, so we're not be able to provide legal advice, but we are giving the most accurate information that we do have for your benefit. We were also down one of the speakers that we had anticipated having, which was an expert from the SBA loan division from a bank out in Portland. But we feel like we've got a wonderful lineup of people who have great experience and good data to be able to help you navigate the crisis and the portions of relief that we have available. So let's get started. I'd like to open the floor up for Heather, who is going to start us off by giving us an overview of the CARES Act and who can benefit from these provisions. Heather?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of today's conversation, and just want to start it off by recognizing that the arts sector is a very dynamic one, and I know that the professionals who are viewing this today encompass for-profit organizations, nonprofit arts organizations, individual and independent artists. And so we're going to do our best today to do a top-line overview of what's available now, while also covering what we hope may come next in various forms of federal assistance. And so as you put the puzzle pieces together, I know that you'll probably be thinking about where your opportunities are today, and then also preparing for weeks and months to come. And at the outset, I think it might be helpful to also clarify that I believe we all know that what is available now is not yet enough, not nearly enough to meet the full needs of the sector. So what I'd like to do is step through not all provisions that are available, but some where you have had most of your frequent questions. And then we'll briefly turn to a Q&A on these different pieces of the puzzle. So on the pandemic unemployment benefits, Lakeisha will be going into far more detail around how these work. But as advocates were weighing in for the creation of new unemployment benefits, a big shift happened in Congress to really recognize the vast number of workers who are part of the gig economy, who have not typically been covered by traditional unemployment benefits administered by the states. So while the federal government was redesigning its partnership with states on unemployment benefits, they recognized that they needed to extend these benefits to self-employed workers, which means the very many arts workers who are self-employed will have access to those benefits. And it will be expanded beyond what's typically available, both in terms of duration and also the amount of assistance given. And Lakeisha will go into more detail on that. But looking from an opportunity and a policy side, one of the challenges we have with accessing these benefits is that because it's a new thing for states to administer these for self-employed workers, very many of them are in a posture of pausing and waiting for federal guidance to be issued to them on exactly how this program should work. So it's really important to have a really good awareness of where your state Department of Labor is in administering these programs. Some of them are inviting individuals to apply for regular benefits, be denied, and then seek unemployment benefits. Others are asking for self-employed workers to simply wait until they have their systems up and running. So it is a bit of a frustration because self-employed workers need this form of help now, and many of them don't yet have access to it. So as we look ahead to the next form of a federal relief package that's being designed, one ask across the arts and culture sector is that increased resources be provided to the states so that they can accommodate what will be a real landslide of requests for this support. And also that the clarifying guidance that's issued to states really works for workers in the gig economy. So that's the very top line on the pandemic unemployment benefits. The next piece is the SBA Economic Injury, Disaster Relief, and Loan Advance Program. And it's important to make some distinctions between how this work happens compared to the Paycheck Protection Program. SBA Economic Injury, Disaster Relief advances are administered directly from the SBA. So applications are made directly to the SBA through their online portal. There is very little guidance available from the SBA in terms of how these work. And so for very many applicants, they really have to jump into that online loan application to step through the questions and understand how the bits and pieces will contribute to relief for their organization. And it's also important to note that these loan advances are available to self-employed individuals as well. Initially, this was meant to be a much broader loan program, a portion of which would be a cash advance of up to $10,000. What we're hearing now and observing when you look at the SBA material on this program is that they're really narrowing it. They do not have nearly enough money to meet demand. So they're constricting this now to requests for loan advances, and they're also capping the loan advances. So for instance, if you're a self-employed individual and you're applying for this form of relief, we're hearing that it may max out at $1,000 at this point. But there is a possibility looking ahead that they might be able to expand that program further if there's increased funding that is approved by Congress. And it's important to really distinguish this from the Paycheck Protection Program in terms of its intent as well. So originally, economic injury disaster loans were really a way of getting a quick cash infusion into organizations that have lost revenue due to a disaster. And that was the original purpose of this. By comparison, as we move to the Paycheck Protection Program, this is a newly created loan program that's meant to keep workers on the payroll. And this program is accessed directly through a local lender that has been backed by the SBA. So for the Paycheck Protection Program, a first step would be to identify a local lender who you would partner with in order to access this form of relief. There is a portal that the SBA makes available to help you find a local SBA lender. So if you don't already have a relationship with a bank that is an SBA approved lender, that will be your first stop, is to find out which lending institutions you can work with. There were 2 phases of this program that have been administered so far. And I would really just encourage you all to look directly at the source for information about all of the many questions you'll have around both how the loan works and also how the forgiveness portion of this works. To date, the SBA and the US Treasury Department have issued interim regulations that immediately guide lenders through how this program will work. Those interim regulations also have a long list of Q&As attached to them. So a lot of questions around eligibility and also how your particular workforce relates to the 8 weeks of payroll cost forgiveness is going to be best found directly in that material. They've also issued guidelines to lenders and to borrowers that include some information to be of help. And then they have a growing FAQ that they add to daily. And I'll just say straight up, there's still a lot of gaps in information about how these work, but I'll try to give a very top line overview. The first phase of Paycheck Protection Program loans that opened up for application focused on organizations that have W-2 workers on their payroll. So in the interim guidelines, the Treasury made clear that if an organization is applying for a Paycheck Protection Program loan, that it's really restricted to cover payroll costs associated with their W-2 workers. And their reasoning is that there's a second phase of Paycheck Protection Program loans that are available to individuals who would be able to provide some applications that would describe their need for relief related to their 1099 income. That second phase of applications opened up last Friday. So the idea is meant to be that organizations and individuals would go to their local lenders, fill out the application, await loan approval, and then on the origination date of the loan, an 8-week calendar starts ticking. And in terms of qualifying for the forgivable part of the loan, you'll be accounting for how you've spent those funds over the course of 8 weeks. And the expectation would be that 75% of those loans would be used, loan funds would be used to maintain your payroll costs. So you really can think of this as we know the weeks and months of the COVID-19 crisis will continue. This is a bit of a stopgap 8-week payroll coverage opportunity. At the end of that period, you would then apply to the loans for forgiveness of that portion. And at that point, they would be checking to see, did you in fact maintain your payroll over the course of that time? And there's some formulas for comparisons involved in that. One thing that is challenging right now is that there isn't a great deal of guidance given yet on the forgivability piece of this. So the experience that we're hearing when it comes to organizations is that many have applied for, and some have been approved for loans, some have received their loan distribution, but there are still questions around how the application process for forgivability will happen. So in terms of an advocacy request, that's something that we'll be watching really carefully. Also, what you've probably heard already is that the banks are blowing through the cash available for this very, very quickly. And there's a prediction that those funds may run out easily by the end of this week. So we're asking for increased funding for this program. And then we're also asking that some changes take place that helps expand eligibility for the Paycheck Protection Program. And one of them would be to remove the 500 employee cap There are, especially in the arts, where they have a number of large-scale productions that cycle workers throughout the season. A surprising number of organizations are exceeding that 500 employee cap. So that would be one request. And then the most important thing, the nearest term thing, is just to make sure that that clarifying guidance, especially for individuals, is improved so that there truly is access to this. Unfortunately, because of the two-phase approach to rolling out this program, individuals were kind of asked to step to the back of the line in the application process, which is really unacceptable, especially as we know that the resources are going really fast. So we're counting on speaking up to get new money added to this program and to increase the accessibility for it. You can move to the next slide now. The additional provisions that were in the CARES Act include a number of programs that we're not going to review here, but I just want to flag for you that are regarding loan opportunities for businesses. And for anyone who's not qualifying for the Paycheck Protection Program, or who simply can't access it due to the limited resources now available, I just want to flag that in our federal assistance resources, we also have a quick overview on these loan programs. You might be hearing this week that there's a lot of buzz about Main Street loans, really inexpensive loans that are run directly from the Fed that's aimed to help businesses through this crisis. There's not much information that's firm yet. They're going to try to narrow in on some public comments on this by this Thursday, and we'll have more information soon. But I just want to make sure to flag that since it's not on our list, but it's an important piece of the puzzle. So the CARES Act included two requests that were sought by arts advocates in the broader nonprofit sector as well. And I think we should really recognize that while these might feel like small gestures in the scale of the damage that needs to be addressed, it's actually a huge step forward in congressional recognition of the unique needs of the nonprofit sector and of the arts sector. So the CARES Act included two provisions related to charitable giving incentives. And across nonprofit arts organizations, charitable giving is about 40% of the revenue that keeps those organizations going. So it was really important to do something to help encourage donors to give more during this critical time, especially as stock market uncertainty and uncertainty about their own financial future has had a chilling effect on charitable giving in a lot of ways. So one measure is to accomplish something that we've actually hoped would be done for many years now, which is to allow non-itemizers, those growing ranks of taxpayers who no longer take who are taking the standard deduction and no longer itemizing, to be incentivized to give more by being able to take an above the line deduction for their charitable contribution. And the CARES Act put this in place for the first time, which means every taxpayer has an incentive to give just a little more. Now, our concern is that the little more is truly a little too little. So we'd like to see that $300 cap on this incentive for giving increased. We'd also like to see it expanded so that it will apply beyond the current tax year. And so we'll see more folks taking advantage of this. The other provision, which is almost on the other end of the donor spectrum, is that tax law routinely requires that donors limit their deductibility of giving to 50% of their adjusted gross income. So for those folks who still itemize, that's usually a cap on top of deductions of giving. For the COVID-19 crisis, as is typical in other disaster, usually location-specific disaster scenarios, the Congress has waived that cap. So now they're encouraging donors to give even more than that and have a tax incentive to do so. So we're glad to see that happen. And our big ask to the Hill on charitable giving incentives really is to increase those opportunities and take them a bit further. And then the other very helpful advance in the CARES Act is related to funding for the National Endowment for the Arts. So there is what I like to think of as a down payment on what we hope to be much bigger access to dedicated funding for cultural workers and for the entire arts and culture sector through dedicated support for from the National Endowment for the Arts. The CARES Act included $75 million, which is distributed both through direct grants from the agency, and 40% of the $75 million in funding is going to the states and regions in a typical formula the agency has used for its routine appropriations. And so this means that it's a really good idea to be staying in touch with your state and regional organizations to see how they'll roll out their plans for making the COVID-19 support from the NEA available. And it's also really important to be aware that the NEA has just, over the last several days, released guidelines to access those direct grants. The grants will be made in a set amount of $50,000. And due to the speed at which they need to cycle this funding through, they're restricting the applicant pool to organizations that have received an NEA grant within the last 4 years. And I just want to encourage you to take a really close look at the NEA's website for all of the information that you'll want to know about how this grant program will work. It's a two-step application process, and the first deadline for applying to get into the grants.gov system is April 22nd. So you want to act fast. It is a competitive grant process. So unlike some of the SBA and paycheck protection programs, you're going to, it's not going to be first come, first served. So please give some thoughtfulness to your applications. And then obviously, probably, as Congress looks ahead to its next relief packages, we're going to be asking for significantly increased resources to meet the unmet demands in the arts sector. And just, I know we're running out of time, but just one quick note too, that I know that there's a great deal of uncertainty about the international artist visas that are required to support international cultural activity, which is really important to be paying attention to as we consider arts and cultural organizations and individuals ramping up to the moment when we once again present art publicly. And we have a website, artistsfromabroad.org, in partnership with APAP that will give you the latest news on that. We also have a slate of advocacy requests that are meant to establish the flexibility and the rapid processing of visas that we'll need as those presentations come back. And then just really quickly on the final slide. So then the next steps in advocacy is just this week, the Congress is looking at a relatively limited piece of legislation that won't be able to make very many changes to the forms of relief available, but is meant to add more funding to it. What comes after next is what we're calling the CARES Act 2.0, which would be a better opportunity to expand programs, add the kind of support that is needed. And there's talk of that package focusing on a theme of infrastructure, as well as expanding ongoing funding of programs that have been created so far. So as we continue to speak up as a community of advocates, it's going to be really important to be talking about where the gaps are in coverage and federal support. And as we do that, to be talking about the people in our sector and the purpose of the work that they're doing and how essential that is to a post-COVID-19 time period. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. This is Tim Wilson at Western Arts Alliance, and I appreciate all your kind of expertise and wisdom and insight you're sharing. Heather, we could spend an hour with you every week, I think. We could just have the Hour with Heather week, our webinar. So I have a bunch of questions around, a lot of questions around eligibility and PPP. So if someone's a sole proprietor or with a small business, such as an agency or manager, does PPP allow them to use the forgivable funds to pay themselves? Do you know?
Yeah, so from what we understand, the intent was to be yes. So that goes to the self-employed workers who would apply for the Paycheck Protection Program. That second application opportunity opened up this past Friday. It's really important to call your lender, ask them what's available for you, describe how you work, and make sure that they can be aware of how you would use these resources. I'll just put a cautionary note. I'm hearing from some who are making those contacts only to find that their bank has run out of funds to lend. But I would say keep those dialogues going with your local lenders. They're going to be your best ally in getting access when more funding is available.
Okay. And are you able to speak to kind of the processing time for kind of PPP funding or EIDL? Any of what are we looking at in terms of the amount of time it takes to process?
So there isn't a standard amount of time available, unfortunately. For just anecdotally, what I'm hearing is that the EIDL, those advances, have been fairly slow to be processed, which, you know, that program was meant to be a really rapid form of relief, and we're kind of hearing that the opposite is occurring. A lot of people got those requests in the door and still haven't heard things after maybe 2 weeks have passed. For those who've been making applications for the Paycheck Protection Program, I'm hearing a faster response rate. Some within 3 days of having their application in have heard back from their lender. But I would also say this is really variable, lender by lender.
Great. And so it's pretty clear what PPP is funding, you know, with the paycheck and payroll and related costs. That's pretty clear. But what about EIDL? What is kind of the range of expenses that it can cover?
So it has a similar array, including payroll costs, but it also has more flexibility for what I would call overhead expenses. And as I said, the Paycheck Protection Program with that 75% payroll requirement has a greater emphasis on payroll. A couple things to note to your theme of putting the puzzle pieces together, whether it's a EIDL loan or advance for the Paycheck Protection Program, you can't use federal funds to cover the same expenses twice or 3 times. So record keeping is going to be really important if you receive, and even if you receive a Paycheck Protection Program loan and, for instance, a National Endowment for the Arts grant, you want to carefully document how you're sequencing coverage of those payroll costs so that you're not using 2 forms of federal assistance to cover the same costs.
Okay. Great. And then I think we have time for maybe one more question. We have many, many questions, but are there restrictions on the type of agencies that can apply for either EIDL or PPP? Like, so for example, what about a university-based presenting program? Can they apply for this funding?
So for the EIDL loan advance, which honestly, I think we're beginning to understand is a much smaller amount of funding available to be of help. That's kind of on the downside. On the upside, there isn't a limit to the size of nonprofits that can apply for that. So limited resources, but bigger eligibility for the EIDL program. The Paycheck Protection Program has that 500 nonprofit employee cap, which is averaged over your payroll periods for the last year. And I think for a number of presenters who may be incorporated under a university, they may find they're bumping up against that ceiling. And if you are among the organizations in that group, please join us in asking Congress to make that change, remove that cap.
Great. So you touched on, Heather, this is my last question for you. You touched on kind of if someone did not have a relationship with a lender, that they could go to the website where they could find the PPP website where they could find kind of referrals to bankers that are interested in entertaining applications. But does that put that applicant at a disadvantage over someone who has an existing kind of relationship with a bank?
Yes, this is a challenge. It's not something that's insurmountable, but this is also where it's variable from lender to lender. So we know that there were some lenders who said we're prioritizing account holders that we already have a lending relationship with. So it's not just enough maybe to have a checking account, but if you don't have a loan relationship to them, they might not be open for business for you. So it's really important to just keep calling SBA-backed lenders until you find one that will be a match for you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for time. I know that you've got a lot going on, and I really appreciate kind of you sharing your time with us this morning. And I'll turn it back to Krista.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you, Tim, and thanks to everybody that's put in questions here. We're logging them. We know that we couldn't get to all of them, but we will be keeping a record of them. And I know that we're working with colleagues like Heather, who are collectively trying to put together a FAQs document around some of these forms of relief. So know that even though it wasn't answered here, we'll work to get you an answer as we have it. So moving on, we've had a lot of questions around unemployment relief, and leave. And so I'm pleased to introduce Lakeisha Caton, who can talk a little bit more about relief available in those areas for employers and employees. Lakeisha?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I will be talking about three main subjects with respect to employment-related relief that's been made available by the government in response to this COVID-19 crisis. So the three subjects I'll be covering is paid leave, the stimulus checks that are now available, and expansion of unemployment benefits, which I know has been touched on a little bit already, but I hope to go into more detail. And before I start, I do want to note that these laws are new. They were made effective in a hurry in a response to this pandemic. And so while guidance has been provided, and it's been provided on a rolling basis, and during my presentation, I'll attempt to answer a number of the questions that we've received. I would note that due to how new this law is, some of your questions we may not be able to answer because we're just looking for further guidance. And so that being said, I'm going to start first with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the Families First Act, which was amended by the CARES Act. And so this act became effective April 1, 2020, so 2 weeks ago, and it's effective through December 31st. And it applies to private employers with under 500 employees. I would note, given the pandemic, a number of employees have been furloughed, which is a fancy term for being put on unpaid leave. And so furloughed employees are not eligible for paid leave under this act, although the CARES Act does make it clear that employees who were laid off after March 1, 2020, and then subsequently rehired, they are entitled to paid leave under this law. And so first, I'll do an overview and just talk about the exemptions. And so the first exemption probably doesn't apply to a number of the participants here, but I would note that healthcare providers and emergency responders are exempt from the benefits of this law. The other exemption, which may apply to a number of the participants here, is employers with fewer than 50 employees may be exempt from this law, where granting paid leave in accordance with this law would threaten the viability of the employer's business. And so essentially, a small business, which is a business with 50 or fewer employees, can claim an exemption from paid leave by showing one of three things. They can either show that providing paid leave in accordance with this law would result in the small business's expensive and financial obligations exceeding the business revenues and would cause the small business to cease operations. They can show that the absence of the employee requesting paid leave would entail a substantial risk to the financial health and operations of the small business because of the employee's specialized skills, knowledge of the business, or responsibilities. Or they can show that there aren't sufficient employees who are able, willing, and qualified, and who will be available at the time and place needed to perform the services provided by the employee requesting paid leave, and that these services are needed for the small business to operate. And so we're still awaiting further regulations on taking advantage of this exemption, but we've been told that if you're planning on trying to take advantage of this exemption, you should document why the viability of your business will be threatened if you grant leave under this act. It's also important to note that there's tax credits available that are meant to offset the cost of providing this leave. And so employers who provide this leave will be a tax credit against the employer's share of payroll taxes for the quarter in which the sick leave pay is paid. And also if you're self-employed, you're also allowed a credit against the self-employment tax. And so again, if you intend to claim a tax credit, you should retain all appropriate documentation and consult any IRS applicable forms, instructions, and potentially an accountant or a tax attorney. And so now I'll get into the specific benefits of this law. Can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So under the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act, this is basically an expansion of the FMLA, which I'm sure a number of you have heard of. The FMLA, you're entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid leave, whereas emergency family and medical leave is paid. And so to be eligible, a covered employee must be employed by the employer for at least 30 days. And eligible employees will be able to take up to 12 weeks of FMLA leave if the employee is unable to work or telework due to a need for leave to care for their child, or if the child's school or place of care has been closed, or the child's child care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19. And so the first 10 days of this leave is unpaid, but after the initial 10-day period, employers are required to provide paid leave an amount not less than 2/3 of an employee's regular rate of pay for the number of hours the employee normally worked. If the employee's schedule changes from week to week, such that the employer cannot determine what hours would be normally worked, the employer is required to provide compensation for the average number of hours the employee was scheduled to work per day over the 6 months period immediately prior to the employee taking leave. And if the employee has not worked for 6 months prior to taking leave, the employer is required to pay the employee based on the employee's reasonable expectation at the time of hire of the average number of hours per day that the employee would normally be scheduled to work. I note though that there is a cap. The payment is capped at $200 per day and $10,000 in the aggregate. So $10,000 is the max you can get over the entire period that you're on emergency FMLA leave. You're also entitled to job protection. Employees that take emergency family and medical leave must be restored to their position when they return to work. However, there is an exemption again for small businesses. So businesses that have fewer than 25 employees, you're not entitled to job protection if your position had to be eliminated while you were on leave and the employer could not find an equivalent position for you after reasonable effort, and for a year following your leave, your employer makes reasonable efforts to contact you if an equivalent position becomes available. Can you go to the next slide, please? And the next type of paid leave that's available under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act is emergency paid sick leave. So employees are eligible for this leave regardless of how long they haven't been employed by their employer. And so there's multiple reasons why you can take this leave, but it's important to note why you're taking the leave, because your reason for taking the leave is going to directly affect how much you can get paid while you're on this leave. And so an eligible employee can take sick leave if an employee's COVID-19 related self-isolation or quarantine is ordered by the federal, state, or local government. You can take this leave if your healthcare provider recommends that you self-isolate or quarantine due to COVID-19. You can take this leave if you're experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and you're seeking a medical diagnosis. And then the other reasons you can take this leave have to do with caring for someone else. So you're eligible for emergency paid sick leave if you're caring for an individual who's been ordered to self-isolate or quarantine by the federal, state, or local government. You can take this leave if you're caring for someone who's been advised by their healthcare provider to self-quarantine or isolate due to COVID-19. Or you can take this leave if you're caring for your own child and the child's school or place of care has been closed, or the child's care provider is unavailable due to COVID-19. And so like I was saying, your payment is going to directly depend on why you're taking this leave. And so full-time employees are eligible for 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave at their regular rate of pay, and part-time employees are eligible for leave at the regular rate of pay for the average number of hours they work over a 2-week period if they are taking leave due to their own COVID-19 related health condition. So if you're a full-time employee, you get your full pay if you're taking this leave because you've been ordered to self-isolate, because your healthcare provider has recommended that you self-isolate, or because you're experiencing COVID-19 symptoms. Although again, there's a cap. The cap is $511 per day, or $5,110 in the aggregate. So over the entire period of time that you're receiving paid sick leave, you can only receive a max of $5,110. And now if you're taking leave for any of the other reasons, so full-time and part-time employees are eligible for emergency paid sick leave at 2/3 the regular rate of pay if they're taking leave due to someone else's COVID-19 related health condition. So if you're taking leave because your child isn't able to go to school because their school has been closed, or because you're taking care of someone who's been self-isolated by the government, then you're eligible for 2/3 of your regular rate of pay. Again, with the cap here is $200 per day or $2,000 over the entire paid sick leave period. And if you're eligible for both emergency FMLA leave and emergency paid sick leave, the two laws run concurrently. Can you go to the next slide, please? So on to the next topic, which is direct payments. So under the CARES Act, individuals may be eligible for a one-time payment of $1,200 per adult earning $75,000 or less, or if you're the head of household and you earn $112,500 or less. And couples are eligible for a one-time payment of $2,400 where they jointly earn $150,000 or less. Note, if you have children, you're eligible for a one-time payment of $500 per qualifying child. And a qualifying child is a child who's under the age of 17. So for example, let's say you're a couple, and as a couple, you earn $140,000, and you have 2 kids, and both kids are under the age of 17, you'd be entitled to a one-time stimulus check of $3,400. So if you earn above the thresholds I just mentioned, your benefits are going to be reduced until they're eventually phased out once you make too much money. And so essentially the rebate amount is reduced by $5 for each $100 that your income exceeds the minimum thresholds I just mentioned. So, and then that amount will be completely phased out once you hit a certain income. So if you're an individual, you will not be eligible for a one-time stimulus check if your income exceeds $99,000. If you're the head of household, you will not be eligible for a one-time stimulus check if your income is higher than $146,500. And if you're a couple, you will not be eligible for a stimulus check if your income exceeds, your combined income exceeds $198,000. So generally, the government is going to look at your 2019 tax return to determine eligibility. And if you didn't file taxes in 2019, the government will then go back further and look at your 2018 tax returns. And so the US Treasury recently said that the first coronavirus stimulus checks have gone out and that many Americans will get their payments by April 15th, so by tomorrow. Can you please go to the next slide? And my final topic, which is unemployment benefits and the expansion by the CARES Act. And so in order to participate in this federal program, the states have to agree, but I imagine almost all of them are going to agree because essentially you're getting federal funding, so there'd be no point in not agreeing. But in participating states, the program provides a number of things. And so first off, the federal government will fully fund the first week of unemployment benefits for states that suspend any waiting periods for benefits. And so for example, in New York, typically when you apply for unemployment benefits, there's a 1-week waiting period. And so for that 1 week, you will not receive any benefits. And then once that 1 week passes, then you'll start receiving benefits. And so New York has waived that waiting period. And so because of that, the federal government will now fully fund that first week of unemployment benefits. And also now there won't be a waiting period for people who are applying for unemployment benefits, which is good. One of the other benefits of this program is that workers may receive $600 per week in increased benefits, in addition to their weekly unemployment check for up to 4 months. And so basically through July 31, 2020, you can receive $600 per week on top of whatever unemployment benefits you would normally receive. And when you start seeing that extra $600, depends on which state you're in. So for example, I believe New York State recently announced that workers will start to see the extra $600 in their benefits as of last week. And one question we did have, which I thought of myself when I was learning about the CARES Act, is it possible that they'll extend this deadline, right? And that past July 31, you'll be able to receive $600 on top of your normal unemployment benefits. And unfortunately, the answer is, I don't know. I would imagine that they're probably going to see how things evolve, where we are with this virus, where we are with unemployment, which, as all of you know, is experiencing a huge number of applicants right now, like an unprecedented number. So I imagine this might be a decision they're waiting to make, but unfortunately, I don't know whether or not you'll be able to receive $600 per week past July 31. So I would just, for now, because this is the date we have, I'd assume that once July 31, 2020 passes, that you won't be eligible for the additional $600 per week. The federal government is also funding up to an additional 13 weeks of regular unemployment benefits through December 31, 2020 for those who remain unemployed and have exhausted their state benefits. So for example, again, in New York, you're eligible for unemployment benefits for up to a maximum of 26 weeks. But now, due to the CARES Act, you can be eligible for unemployment benefits for an additional 13 weeks on top of the 26 weeks, so for a total of 39 weeks. It's also important to note that unemployment benefits have also been expanded in a program that I believe Heather mentioned earlier, but the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which provides unemployment benefits to individuals who otherwise would be ineligible for such benefits under state or federal law. So for example, individuals who are self-employed, like independent contractors and consultants, or who are seeking part-time employment, or who lack sufficient work history, they could be entitled to unemployment benefits now under this Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. The Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program covers any individual who, 1, is not otherwise eligible for or has exhausted all rights to unemployment benefits, and 2, is unemployed, partially unemployed, or unable to work due to COVID-19 related circumstances. So again, I note, because this is one of the questions we got, and it's one of the questions I'm getting a lot from clients, like, because there's a number of employers who are struggling, obviously, with this COVID-19, but they're trying their best not to lay off their employees. And so in order to do that, one thing they're trying to see if they can do is to reduce their hours, and then hopefully the payment they'll get from their employer plus unemployment will be sufficient. And that is a question we've gotten about, what if your employer reduces your hours? And so it is quite possible that you will be eligible for unemployment benefits. But unfortunately, unemployment benefits is a very state-specific area. So I'll give an example from New York, because that's the law I know best as a practicing attorney in New York. So in New York, in order to be eligible for partial unemployment benefits, you have to work less than 4 days a week and earn $504 or less. So let's say you were working full-time, but your employer reduced your hours such that now you're working 3 days a week and you're earning $500 gross a week. In that circumstance, you'd be eligible for partial unemployment benefits. And then on top of that, you'd be eligible for the $600 per week payment. So that about sums up my presentation, but I believe there's maybe a few additional questions.
Oh yes, Lakeisha, this is Tim. We have many questions for you. So I want to start because we ended up there was a lot of questions around the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. And so the first question we got is, can you bundle that funding and support with other CARES Act kind of support? Are those separate funds, and you can apply for each?
Well, and when you say separate relief, like, are you talking about emergency FMLA?
Or through PPP or EIDL? These are, separate pots. So can these things essentially be pursued at the same time?
I believe, yes, that they can. I would note them. This is, unfortunately, there's a number of questions that we're still waiting for guidance on. It's very clear with respect to emergency FMLA leave and emergency paid sick leave and PTO that you can, with like PTO, for example, you can use your PTO to get additional, to like put it together with your paid sick leave act in order to get your full wages. And like with emergency sick leave and FMLA, there's like very clear guidelines and how these things work together.
Right. Great.
So I will say I won't have clear guidance on this, but I believe that you can like go for the multiple pots and try to, increase your benefits as much as you can.
Great. So can someone take Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act funding for a parent who has COVID-19? Is that an eligible situation?
Yes, as long as their parent, one, if the parent is under a government order to self-isolate, but even if your parent's caretaker recommended that your parent self-isolate or quarantine, which I think is the case a lot of the times now, because that's a vulnerable population, yes, you'd be eligible for emergency paid sick leave.
Great. I'm going to turn our questions to the unemployment kind of section of our questions. We have a lot of questions related to unemployment. So many artists work, 4 or 5 jobs, and so the situation is kind of what kind of benefits will they qualify when they've been working many, many jobs? Some jobs may be sort of had hours and wages cut, others may be sort of kind of more normal. And how does that work when an individual is working multiple jobs and may have contract income on top of that? How does that affect their approach to unemployment?
So, this is just really fact specific because it's going to depend on where these jobs were and where you were working is essentially going to dictate where you're going to file. And then each state has different laws with respect to like partial unemployment benefits, like how many hours you have to work in order to be eligible for partial unemployment, or how many days, like I gave New York State as an example. So it's hard for me to answer that generally, because it just really depends on the specific facts.
Okay, great. Thank you. So those of you that are asking that kind of related question, you're going to need to go back to your own State Department of Labor. So we have one question very specific to New York. Is the work search requirement of 3 documented work searches, are those still in effect? Have they been suspended under this program?
Yeah, I was looking at that recently. I believe they've been suspended because it is under the CARES Act. It's up to the state if they want to relax those standards. And I believe New York State has relaxed them.
Okay, great. What about someone who is a sole owner of an S Corp? What do they need to do to sort of be able to qualify for the unemployment, and what resources do they need to be able to kind of document their case? Are they eligible, and how do they sort of manage that in an S Corp?
So I believe they'd be eligible, but again, so are they, and it's just getting into facts, like were their hours reduced? Are they not working at all? Are they collecting any money?
Yeah, if this is an agency, Lakeisha, they're probably seeing all of their income. They may be working but without income, because all of their tours through the spring and summer and perhaps into the fall are canceling or being pushed out, and so their income is just evaporated.
And so yes, I would believe that would be covered by, especially the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Act, which the purpose is to cover everyone, including people who normally wouldn't be eligible for unemployment, but who are unable to work or making income because of COVID-19.
Okay, great. And this is related to the question I asked earlier, but it's a slightly different angle from another participant. What if someone has kind of lost the income that they received, or most of their income that they received as a 1099 filing performer? So they have lost much of that income, but they're still seeing some contractual income. Can they kind of factor that, or how does that sort of qualify them or disqualify them from UI?
So one thing I would note, like generally, because we get a lot of questions from people like, am I eligible? And my first statement is always apply. Like there's no harm, and you're always better off applying and being told that you're not eligible for XY reason, then assuming that you're ineligible and not applying. With that being said, in that circumstance, yes, if you're 1099, as we were discussing earlier, this Pandemic Unemployment Relief Act now covers independent contractors. So if you're an independent contractor and you've lost income or you're working less because of COVID-19, then yes, you potentially be eligible for partial unemployment on top of the $600 per week.
Okay. We have many, many questions coming in right now. So okay, so Mike has a statement that unemployment situation is kind of mind-numbing. Artists perform shows all over the country, multiple states, different gigs, different types of pay. The problem is existing unemployment portal and process doesn't really sort of help them as gig workers or musicians. So do you have any advice about how they sort of, I mean, you said apply, that's really great advice. Everybody should apply. But any advice on sort of that, you know, for a gig worker kind of in this situation?
So one thing I noted is that the participants here, they're probably working in a large number of different states, right? So they're contracting, so they're collecting income from different states. And so again, while a lot of the guidance on like where to apply and how to apply is going to depend on the state's websites, I did take a look at the New York State DOL website, and they provide guidance about if you worked in 2 or more states outside of New York in the past 18 months, you should file your claim in one of those states where you worked. And then it will be in the onus of that state to collect from funds from all the other states where you performed.
Okay.
Which I think does make it easier for people who've worked all over.
Great. I have one more question for you, Lakeisha, and then I'll let you go. Somebody is asking, they applied on April 4th and they go online and it says it's still pending. I know you can't sort of see inside of the inner workings of every state unemployment agency, but how long should this process of kind of, you know, for processing approval or denial generally take place? Or in this environment, how long is it taking to process?
That's so hard to say, because I was looking, it's either New York or New Jersey, and they're saying you file, maybe it was New Jersey, and you hear back within like 10 days, and then you start receiving benefits within X amount of weeks. And I think that has just gone so far out the window at this point that there's really no guidance on when you're going to start receiving anything. I'd say, of course, apply, keep checking. I know in New York State, they've recently hired a large number of individuals to start working for the unemployment division. So they're hopeful that that will help process things quicker. And I do feel your pain, but I have no idea how better things will get over time. I just hope they do get better.
Great. Well, again, thank you so much, Lakeisha. This is really so helpful to share your insight and knowledge of these programs. So appreciate your time today. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Krista.
Thank you, Tim. Lakeisha, thank you so much. We really appreciate your guidance and expertise and sharing that with us. And for those of you who had questions that were unanswered, again, we'll capture those and work to get answers for you so you have them. And then, so finally, we'd like to wrap up with Maura Brennan, who is from the MAP Fund, to talk about a recently released pot of money and wonderful resource for individual artists. So Maura, can you share with us what you have to share with us today?
Hi, everybody. It's so lovely to be with you. I hope everybody's well, and it was really great and informative to hear from the other speakers. So thanks for inviting me. Delighted to be here. I was getting crystal clear, internet access until the minute Krista introduced me, and then it started to break up. So if I go out, I apologize. I seem to be coming in and out a little bit. So yes, I'm so happy to be able to introduce to you the Artist Relief Fund. It's an emergency initiative organized by 7 regranting organizations. They are the Academy of American Poets, Artadia, Creative Capital, the Foundation for Contemporary Arts, the MAP Fund, National Young Arts Foundation, and U.S. Artists, United States Artists. So these are all mid-sized national arts grant makers that collectively touch into a pretty wide spectrum of disciplines, practices, and geographies. And that was part of the strategy of bringing us together, was that we could cover a lot of ground collectively. The fund, and by the way, we came together rather organically. It was just this moment that I think is kind of characteristic of everything that we've been going through, which is, you know, you sort of turn to the person next to you and say, what can we do? And it's not the way things usually function, but it's been one of the great insights of this experience is that we have perhaps more flexibility and latitude than we think we do, and hoping to carry that forward into the future. The fund is making $5,000 emergency relief grants to artists. And right now it's planned to operate through September. It launched last Wednesday, April 8th, with $10 million, and $5 million of that was seed funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So that $5 million was raised from something like 20 foundations in the course of about 10 days. And then Mellon came in with another 5 to seed, with the thought being we will continue to actively fundraise as we go on. To that point, around $100,000 has been raised in individual donations through the website and through email since the launch last week. So that's really great news. We are in the first week. The plan right now, we're sort of using this first week to the degree possible as a pilot to test out things that we put together, the systems, and to understand better sort of what we're up against. So I will say for this week, the plan is to make 100 grants per week across all 10 disciplines. And those disciplines are theater, music, dance, media, craft, traditional arts, film, video, design, visual arts, and writing. And I just want to add there that, you know, I know a lot of individual artists don't really identify in a single discipline. And so it's a little awkward to ask people to tick a box, and you can only tick one box on the application. But that was so that we have a system for routing applications to be reviewed by nonprofit partners, which I'll talk about in a second. So it's really just a mechanism for efficiency. And I don't want any artist to be put off by, you know, being frustrated that that doesn't perfectly define their practice if their practice is a hybrid practice. So right now, the distribution of those grants will be roughly proportional to the applications we receive per discipline. For example, you know, if we got a majority of a majority of applications in theater, the majority of grants would go to theater, more or less. There will be a cap on no one discipline getting over X number of grants, and there will be a minimum number of grants. But that's sort of how we're thinking about the distribution per discipline. Eligibility requirements, they are few because we're hoping to make this as broadly applicable as possible, but you must be over 21 years old. You must be able to provide a W-9 or a social security number or an individual taxpayer ID number after you've been notified for submission. So we wanted to be careful there about you know, what it means to be undocumented in this country right now and what the implications of that are. So those requirements are stated specifically in that way for that reason. No member of the coalition or their families or boards can apply for this grant, and you must be a practicing artist able to demonstrate a sustained commitment to your work, your career, and a public audience. And this definition can include individuals making a living from their work independently or commercially, and anyone whose livelihood and or community depends upon the ability to make, exhibit, perform, publish, or sell artwork. This also includes culture bearers and community organizers who self-define as artists. So really trying to understand the broad definition that we all take of artists today. And I know there was a couple of questions about that previously, and we can talk about that a little bit when we get a second. Because of the anticipated volume of applications and the limited funds, or relatively limited funds, and also because we are aligned with the missions of each of these individual organizations, as well as those who are funding this project, we have an eye toward granting equitably and looking across geographies and backgrounds and disciplines to support in a balanced way. Applications will be reviewed on a week-by-week basis by our coalition partners and representatives from cultural organizations around the country. So after reviewing, qualified applicants will be selected via a lottery process for funding each week. So to go into that just a little bit more specifically, what happens is that after you submit an application, which by the way is designed to be extremely straightforward, easily done on a tablet or a mobile phone or a computer, there are no uploads, no work samples required, no financial documents required. After you upload, in addition to stating your eligibility around those things I just named, you also will indicate your level of need and vulnerability and risk. And that particular inquiry around level of need will be tagged by the application itself as a significant factor in whether or not that application will be reviewed. So there's a little bit of a sorting mechanism that happens on the first application phase. Those who exhibit a high level of need, dire financial straits, and a number of others, depending on how much room there is after we reach that number, will then be moved to our nonprofit partners out in the field for review, essentially validating the eligibility and offering any further information that those sort of on the ground actors, those nonprofits, might be able to provide for us on the applications. Once those applications come back from the nonprofit partners, they are put into a lottery. Sorry, I should mention that 2,000 applications will go out to the nonprofit partners, so 200 per discipline will go out to the nonprofit partners. Once those are vetted by those partners, they come back and they are put into a lottery, and of those, 100 will be selected for funding. So that's the process, essentially. I think there's something to be said about sort of scaling expectations around this project. So we opened last Wednesday, and within about the first 36 hours, we received 30,000 applications. And if we're looking at that $10 million frame with $5,000 per grant, the total number of grantees we would be able to have with this project, from now through September, is 2,000 recipients. And in the first 36 hours, we received 30,000. We're now up to about 45,000. So that implies two things. One is that that need, that definition need, and the sort of framing of this grant for artists who are in dire economic conditions. So we're not necessarily just talking about somebody whose project was canceled or whose work is suspended for the moment. We're talking about people who are losing housing, people who don't have access to medical care, people who don't have enough money to buy food. That's the population among artists that this program is trying to reach first. As we move down the line, if we see that, the world starts to hobble back to normalcy and those immediate dangerous needs have been alleviated, and then there are funds remaining, we will start to look again at the eligibility requirements and start to see if we can cover some of those other kinds of losses. And within that, I just want to say we are asking artists in the field to consider that factor before applying. If you are not somebody who can be said to be in danger because of the financial loss due to COVID-19, this may not be the moment for you to apply, because as you can see from the numbers, there are many, many folks who are in that situation. So that's an overview of the funding aspect of the program. I also wanted to note that there are other resources available through Artist Relief. Two of them are survey related, which I know there have been a lot of surveys going around, and there might be a little bit of tad of exhaustion around artists and arts organizations offering their feedback for survey purposes, but it is so important for advocacy. So we've partnered with Americans for the Arts to collect data from individual artists and arts organizations to be able to aggregate that data and go to our electeds with that, and also go to foundations for that to increase our funding. So I urge everybody to go to the APTA website and fill out those surveys if you haven't already. And then the other piece is that Creative Capital, which is one of the partners, is heading up the sort of non-monetary support that that the grant will provide. So there will be weekly wellness sessions, free weekly wellness sessions hosted by Creative Capital that are a part of Artist Relief. There are bi-weekly conversations that will be hosted by one of each of the coalition members. And those are going to be on a variety of topics. I know somebody is pulling together something about what philanthropy in general looks like right now in response to COVID-19. We're looking at doing something with artists and producers and presenters and sort of the contract complications that have surfaced as a result of COVID-19. And there'll be a number of others. And then finally, there's hopefully going to be a monthly sort of state of the arts talk or fireside chat kind of thing that we can all sort of gather around and get a sense of our bearings at the moment based on the information we're collecting and what we're seeing in these applications. So I think that's the overview.
Thank you, Maura. I have a few questions for you. So the first off, have you considered kind of reducing the amount of awards given sort of the overwhelming demand? Is that something that you've considered, or kind of rejecting that sort of approach to be able to provide a little support to more people?
Yeah, it actually hasn't come up in our conversations. And I will raise that with the group. It's an interesting idea. I know the $5,000 mark was actually, already reduced from what the group sort of felt was an appropriate response. And it was a compromise between what we felt we could raise and the number of applications expected. But with this unbelievable increase that we saw immediately, that's an important topic of conversation.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. The next set of questions all have to do with kind of eligibility and restrictions. So for example, Allison and Danielle are asking if agents or managers of artists are eligible under this program to apply.
Right. So you will have to state in the application sort of what I described as making a case for your role as an artist with a public and your sustainment of a practice over time. So I think there's no reason not to try to make that case as an agent, but it is not explicitly for quote unquote arts workers. It is for artists. I just want to add on that really briefly that I do think this particular issue has become so glaringly apparent, our interdependency in the course of this disaster. And I think if Artist Relief can't really address it, I know it is inspiring a lot of us and a lot of others to begin to look at that interdependency a little more carefully so that all arts workers are protected when something like this happens.
And you've answered, I think, the question from another participant who asked about sort of people beyond kind of agents and managers, but curators and producers who are engaged in artistic work. So they would make the same case, but would have this, the same kind of challenge to be able to sort of make that case.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't know, unless I'm not seeing any other related questions for you. We have, as Krista has mentioned from the other speakers, we have lots of questions that we didn't get to, and I'm sorry we didn't have time for all of those, but I'm going to turn it back to Krista and to Robbie to kind of wrap us up. Thanks again, Maura. I really appreciate your participation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you, Maura. Thank you, Tim, too, for all of the fielding of the questions. And thank you all so much for joining us today. I will share and just underscore Maura's point about the interdependence of our field. We hear you. We are with you, knowing that agents and managers and artists and cultural workers and curators, in addition to presenting organizations and artists, are part of this one ecosystem. And we're working very hard on the advocacy end to make sure that all of the players have access to relief, However successful we are is still undetermined, but know that we are working very hard to make sure that the people that we're advocating to understand the cultural industry and that there are many players in it. So I just want to make sure that I shared that. I do want to let you know that APAC as a group will continue to offer webinars in the coming weeks. You can find more of that information on the APAP website, but there will be 2 coming up on April 21st and April 28th around live streaming. So the one on the 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time is an Ask the Expert, which will focus on the legal ramifications and issues around live streaming. And then the one following will be around technical Ask the Expert issues and questions, how to live stream, how to do it effectively, what are some good resources and platforms, etc. So we hope that you'll join us for those. As far as APAC is concerned, APAP, APAP will have another webinar tomorrow with Dana Fortno, who is a psychologist and a musician, who will be talking about just mental well-being and mental health as we navigate through the COVID-19 crisis. So we hope that you'll join us for that. And with that, I will wrap up on my end and pass it over to Robbie.
And I will just add that the recording will be on our website soon, and we will also be sending out a brief survey to our registrants and participants today. So we hope you will provide us with your feedback. Thank you once again for joining us, everyone, today, and we hope that you'll join us again soon.